What's up, boys and girls? This is Pete Clark. Knowing when to value bet and when not to, how big to go, is one of the most crucial skills in the inventory of the winning poker player. In today's video, we're going to learn 5 transformational principles that are going to help you boost your win rate by understanding this crucial subject. Let's get into it. There are actually a ton of misconceptions about value betting. Some things that seem automatically fine and true are actually false, and there are some really tricky counterintuitive things that you can be doing to boost your win rate in this area. Let's start with principle number 1. This is perhaps the weirdest principle of all 5. Getting called is not the goal of value betting. What? Has Pete completely lost the plot here? Actually, no. Fearing your opponent folding is one of the biggest sort of mental game pitfalls I see in students. There's a temptation when you're about to make a value bet, you've got a very strong hand, to ensure your opponent calls at all costs, to pick a size that we think he's going to call. But when we do that, we're actually prioritizing the frequency that we get called at, when really what we should be doing in most spots is prioritizing the size of the pot we can win when we get called. And there's some really good theoretical reasons for that, but I'm going to illustrate this concept by going to a hand I played recently, and hopefully this will clear it up for you. So we get dealt 4 or 5 of diamonds on the cutoff, and we decide to 3-bet this time. This is something that we can do, no worries with this. I won't spend too much time dwelling on pre-flop. Villain 4 bets, and if we do 3-bet this hand, guys, this is actually going to be one of the livest drawing hands that we can have against the under the gun 4-bet range. This range is full of stuff like aces, kings, queens, ace, king, and then bluffs, so 4-5 is actually going to be a lot more live than something like jack 10 here or queen 9 or anything like that. So this hand can definitely call. It's going to be doing very well when it connects with flops. It's going to be, the lower flops are going to be very unique to our range, and we're not going to have to worry about straight over straight or trips over trips or anything like that with this hand for the most part. So 7-3 deuce, and villain goes for a kind of standard small c-bet, and we decide to call. We could also play some raising here. I think it would be fine. Queen of hearts turn, and it goes check check here. Though I think there are maybe arguments for betting here, but I won't get into that too much. I think probably the hand is mostly a check, if not a pure check. Then on the river, the ace of spades comes down, and villain checks again. So here it's kind of standard, right? We've only got just over a pot left, and you might look at this hand and think, gotta have the immortal nuts. And sometimes students want to pick a sizing that they think a certain hand will call. They will think about like, oh, what if villain has a queen? What if villain has pocket kings? I don't put him on ace king because he would have bet, so he's probably not going to call my all in. But the fact is that in this spot, I have bluffs in my range, right? I can be turning under pairs into bluffs here. Villain has bluff catches in his range. They could be ace x, they could be kings, they could be jacks, they could be queen x. But either way, there's going to be a very real frequency where when I jam here, I'm going to get called. It's not the case that a reasonable poker player that's not like super tight is just going to fold everything here. It's true that the bigger we go, the more fold equity we get. So when we go this size, we get loads more fold equity than if we bet half pot. Half pot gets the bet called way more often. But the objective of value betting is not to get called. The objective is to win a lot of money if you get called. And that's a really different thing. In this hand, we do actually get called. We run into, like, I guess what's sort of the top of villain's range on this node, though it would be reasonable for him to play ace queen or aces this way as well, with sort of unblockers to my bluffing range and all of this stuff. But at a very basic level here, we're prioritizing magnitude. We're prioritizing how much we win when we win. We're not trying to force him to call us. As a very basic thought experiment, if I was trying to get called as often as possible, I'd just bet 1 big blind. There's no way that's optimal. Betting 1/66th of the pot. That's not going to be optimal. And so clearly prioritizing the frequency we get called at is not the idea. The idea is to instead prioritize the magnitude of the pot that we can win when called. Bear this one in mind, guys. When you're value betting, you're not trying to get called. Usually you're trying to make lots of money if your bet gets called. Now, of course, there are times when you want to bet smaller. What we're really dealing with here is having the immortal nuts on the river, the last chance possible for betting, and that's why it's so urgent to go all in here. Clearly, like earlier on in the hand and stuff like that, you guys don't need to like make gigantic 3x pot bets at every single street. I'm not saying that, but when you do get to the river, last chance to bet, you're in position you've got the nuts. Usually, more often than not, the correct sizing is the largest one possible. And yeah, you won't get called as often, but when you do, it's pretty great. Principle number 2, you need to be a favorite versus villain's overall calling range and not just part of it. And the reason that I bring this one up is that there's a kind of plague in the poker world right now where people talk about targeting. They say, I'm going to bet here for value to target King X, to target the flush draw, to target the straight draws. You hear this all the time, right? But this sort of thought process is actually unnecessarily blinkered. It's kind of limiting the scope of how much of villain's range we're thinking about for no good reason. What we should really be doing instead here is thinking about villain's overall range, not just the range he gets to that spot with, but the range he'll continue with after you bet. You want to be a favorite against that overall continuing range. So you can't just pick and choose one part of it to play against and pretend he has that. That's not good poker. It's easy and it's lazy, but it's not good poker. Let's take a hand that illustrates this point. So in this next one, we have ace-9 offsuit. This is a hand that's kind of break even to open in the cutoff. We do decide to open it. If there's ever a weaker player at the table, I'll pretty much be making this open all the time because the idea it would swing to being a positive winning open. And the big blind calls. This is some kind of unknown player to me. I don't remember having seen this guy before. 9-3 deuce two-tone, and we're going to be playing our large c-bet strategy on this board. I think ace-9 with ace of diamonds is such a great hand to bet that it just always bets. And the reasons for this are that it really is interested in building a big pot. It has, you know, all kinds of diamond nutted redraw things going on here, some backdoor straight draws. It can just handle itself well in a big pot on lots of different runouts. And yeah, this one's going to be a pure bet. I think villain calls onto the turn. I think another pure bet, ace-9, just a super high EV hand in position. More about this later, but in position we're not going to do so much slow playing. Hint, hint, something coming up on this very soon in this video. But the main point for now is that we will reach the river here, and this is a spot where it would be very possible for us to fall into the trap of targeting to put villain on a certain type of hand, or put on our sort of blinkers and only look at one part of his range. And when you might hear a poker player, annotator, commentator, streamer, YouTuber say something like, I bet here to target 10-9, Jack-9, Queen-9, pocket 8s, 7x, 3x. And yeah, it's very true that when you bet here, if you bet sort of small enough, those hands will be calling you at some frequency. You also have this diamond blocker. This hand is not a million miles away from a value bet, honestly. But the problem is that villain's range has already contracted twice and in quite a major way after we overbet the flop, and it's going to contract a third time when I bet this river. So if I bet this river, what I can expect to happen is that some hands will bluff raise me, some hands will value raise me because there'll be flushes or something like that, and then villain will continue for sure with any sort of two-pair combo. The king he doesn't have super often here, so that's kind of okay, but he does have some king-3, king-deuce kind of combos still, and certainly king-9. And so I think if I'm to bet here, I'm probably just going to value town myself more than anything. If you're playing against someone super passive that's not going to do a good job of raising you here, it's probably okay to make a thin value bet. But in this situation, the theory is going to indicate a check. And the reason is that although I can single out some parts of villain's range that are worse that call me, my overall outlook when I bet here and get action is going to be that hands like two-pair and flushes will continue, and a lot of the weaker hands will fold, and therefore the range I end up isolating myself against after I bet and get called here. It's not that we only get called by a better. You hear this as well. Oh, if we bet, we'll only get called by a better. That's ludicrous. That's completely insane. Listen to yourself, right? That's nonsense. But we will get called by a range that's sufficiently strong enough to make reopening the action here and value betting not a great idea. But you can end up value betting too thinly in these spots if you tunnel in on villain having Jack-9 of spades. Imagine that he has a hand like that and then target it. Really silly unless you can see that that's what he's got, right? So you've got to be super careful in these spots that you think about the overall outlook against your opponent's range and not just a part of it that's sort of jumping out at you. Our next principle of value betting is that slow playing out of position is often fine, whereas slow playing in position is usually a mistake. Now, when I say slow playing here, I'll just be very clear about what I mean. What we're talking about is betting the absolute sort of top of our range, not betting a hand that's very far up our range, that's like extremely capable of value betting, would be a slow play. And in many cases, this is okay. So why is it okay out of position usually, but not in position? It all comes down to urgency for building the pot and how many opportunities your opponent has to bet if you don't bet. So if I check to you and I'm out of position, I can at least rest assured that sometimes you will bet. You will bet some of your bluffs, semi-bluffs, and value hands, and you will open the action up for me on that same street that I checked on, and I'll be able to actually then bet, i.e. raise. I'll be able to check raise you, right, if I have the top of my range. So in spots where I'm able to check raise you, I'm actually okay checking to you sometimes with a really, really strong hand that would have been capable of value betting. And moreover, theory actually suggests that I should check many really, really good hands out of position in order to build very big pots by check raising. That's actually a staple of GTO. In position though, if I check back, what happens is I go to the next street without any pot growth. And yeah, the stagnated pot is not good for me, right? If you check the turn in position, you will always go to the river, because guess what? Your opponent doesn't have a chance to bet. Let's take a hand example on this one. So in this next hand we have ace queen in the small blind. We decide to actually flat here. Not everyone plays a flattening range in this spot. I do. I won't talk about that too much for now. Big blind comes along as well, three-way pot, and we start with a check. Villain bets half pot. I would expect his range to be fairly polar for this sort of sizing. Probably something like good king x trips plus for value and some bluffs. We raise this time. I don't think it's mandatory to raise here, but we do. And villain folds in the big blind. Turn comes the four of hearts. Now this is a spot where my value region has just changed a lot. Like if you think about my range here, on the flop it was formerly trips, full houses, not much else. Now I've just added a bunch of sort of mediocre to good hands to my range in the form of flushes. I have all different types of flushes here, some nut flushes and some weaker ones too. Given that, I think using a smaller bet here makes a lot of sense for my range. This way I can continue to value bet a lot of hands, and given that this is a good turn for my range, I also want to be betting this turn at a high frequency. Ace queen is somewhere near the bottom of my value range here, but because my sizing is small, I think this is okay. Villain calls and we go to the ace of diamonds river. This card is really weird. It's bittersweet. We do still lose to some bigger boats. However, we beat hands such as nut flushes, lower flushes, queen x, king queen. So really good river for a range. The idea here is that because we're out of position, checking is actually fine. I do decide to check here. One of the reasons for this is that villain has the option of betting. He can be betting both value hands that I beat and bluffs that I beat. So in this situation, when he polarizes his range by betting here, I'm going to be getting value not just from weaker value hands like the nut flush or king queen that are absolutely incentivized to value bet, but I'm also going to be getting value from hands like king 10 with the 10 of hearts, or king jack with the jack of hearts, or something like this that the villain is supposed to turn into a bluff here. Against a more passive, weaker player, I wouldn't really make this check. I would just jam and prioritize getting all the value. But against a strong player here who's going to be able to fold flushes and stuff a lot, if I shove and will understand that the bottom of his range should now be turned into a bluff, I think this check makes a lot of sense. But crucially, it makes sense because we're out of position. If we were in position here, this would clearly just be madness, right? My next principle for value betting is on the river, make your thick value bets. That means your ones that are really high equity, that are not close at all, make those bigger, and make your thin value bets smaller. When I first suggest this to students, they have a common sort of objection where they say, but Pete, doesn't that make me unbalanced? Doesn't that make me exploitable? And the answer is no. Solvers actually play like this. Game theory plays like this. And the reason that we play this way is that we don't want to balance our value bets with other different value bets. That's not really how game theory works. We want to balance our value bets with our bluffs, right? So as long as we have a certain amount of bluffs for each bet size in our range, we're allowed to put all of our big hands into our large sizing on the river and put our thinner ones into our smaller sizing. Let's take an example of how this works in practice. So in this next spot we have queen 6 of spades in the small blind. This is a weaker player, as you can sort of make out from the stack size here. In the big blind we open to 3x and he calls. The flop comes queen 9-5, bet and check are both totally fine here. I only use small bets, blind versus blind, for reasons I won't go into just now, and I decide to bet 22% pot here. Villain makes the call. On the turn I have two options. This hand is not quite good enough for an overbet, which would be my large sizing option here in my toolkit, but my other sizing option is a block bet, and it's certainly fine for that. It's also fine to check here and check call. We decide to bet here. Again, you can slow play out of position, as we saw in point 3. Being out of position here will allow our opponent to bluff and value bet, and we'll be able to continue really profitably against that range. So check is definitely fine here too. This time though, we decide to bet and villain calls again. The river comes a really nasty card that seriously degrades the worth of our hand. That said, we are still going to have a reasonable slab of equity here because we've bet small twice. We've not caused that much of a contraction or a filtering in our opponent's range, and therefore our equity is going to be sufficient here to bet as long as we size it really small. We decide to bet 22% pot again for a third time. We've basically just gone small bet, small bet, small bet here, but that's exactly the right investment level for a hand like Queen 6. This doesn't make us exploitable as long as we know which hands we want to call to a raise here. It's possible that we induce a fair amount of action with this bet, so as long as we have a good idea about what hands we want to defend, namely ones with diamond blockers, then value bets like kings with the king of diamonds, aces with the king of diamonds, king queen with the king of diamonds. Hands like this are going to make good defense here. As long as we find them, we don't really have a problem bet folding a hand like Queen 6 for the sizing. And of course, if we were to bet bigger here, it would be a catastrophe for this hand. We'd be overplaying it. This hand is either a check or a small bet. Villain does call with 10-9, and we scoop a fairly nice little pot for the mediocre hand that we had. My final point today is that the check button is better than you think, guys. It's actually your friend. A lot of people neglect this button, and certain students have definitely said, Pete, you're like the ambassador for check. You're like basically the biggest fanboy of the line check ever. And they're right. I love checking in spots where most regs fail to find the correct slow plays, the correct sort of range balancing checks. And indeed, one of the biggest leaks that weaker players have in microstakes games is they have completely unfathomably unprotected checking ranges. Like when you start to see how much a solver will protect its checking range out of position and how much mixing it will do with some seemingly really good value bettable hands, you'll learn that the check button is just theoretically better than you would ever expect it to be. Caveat is if your opponent's very passive and doesn't bluff enough and maybe doesn't value bet thinly enough, you don't really want to give up the chance to value bet, but in theory and against more aggressive foes, it's definitely fine. Let's have a look at our last hand example today that's going to illustrate this principle. And then our final hand today, we have Jack 10 offsuit. We go for 3x open and the villain calls in the big blind. Out of position here, as I said before, I'm just going to have small bets and checks in my arsenal. I decide to small bet this time, given what I roll, and my opponent calls. The turn comes a jack, and I check. So why is check better than you would think here? Like, what's so good about this line? Well, firstly, we're blocking the absolute hell out of his calling range. Now, it's not so important that we block a jack here, because he's going to be both calling and betting with the jack, or maybe even raising, so the jack is kind of investing no matter what we do. The hand that's important to note that we block here is the 10, because this is a hand that will check back a lot if we check the villain here, but will also always call. When you block a hand like this, you're basically getting called at a lower frequency than if you had a hand like Queen Jack or Jack 9 or even Ace Jack or even Pocket Jacks, probably. So given that, we want to go ahead and slow play a hand like this. Check has some really nice hidden benefits here. While we do lose some EV if villain has a hand like the Ace 9 of spades that's going to check back, or Pocket 8s that's going to check back, or King Deuce that's going to check back, we actually gain EV against the bottom of villain's range here. He's called us on the flop with a ton of really flimsy, dead hands like gutters, or just floats that are now going to be bluffing. We really want to be able to get money in against them too. So checking here allows us to do that. We get value from the bottom of our opponent's range. This is a part of the game tree that poker players often neglect or forget about entirely, is that it's not all about coolering villain and making money from his Jack X or 10x here. It's also about getting money from the hands that he would just always fold if we were to bet. So when we have this blocker, I think check is going to become the clear front runner here, the best play. We decide to slow play again here because of the amount of things that we're blocking. If we didn't block a jack and a 10, I would definitely consider raising here, but with these blockers, I think it's okay to delay our raise to the river and go for a check raise at this juncture. We do face another bet, which is a marvelous situation for our hand. We go all in, villain instantly folds, indicating that he probably just had some bluff, and against this bluffing range, the check has actually maximized our value completely. So it's very important to reiterate here that checking has hidden benefits. Yes, it's not as in your face as just betting 3 times and getting called by a 10, but when you block that 10 anyway, you might want to reprioritize your crosshairs here towards the bottom of villain's range and actually look to get as much value from that as you can. And the way to do that is to check call and wait until river to check raise. Note that if villain does have a hand like a straight here, or a worse full house, or maybe even a jack, he's still very likely to bet the river, and we're going to be able to raise and get lots more money into the pot anyway. Again, being out of position helps you slow play, as we saw in point 3. If you like the way I teach the game, if you like the approach of blending theory with practical analysis, then the Carrot Poker School could very well be for you. This is a university style 10-week course with 90-minute lectures once a week. We run 3 different grades, 1, 2, and 3. Grade 1 is for sort of beginning players who are not beginning at poker, but maybe beginning their journey in formal study, haven't worked a lot with GTO principles or solvers yet. Grade 2, more intermediate, definitely for people who are already quite versed in studying the game. Then we have a grade 3 course for more advanced players who are already doing very well at decent stakes. CarrotCorner.com is the place to go if you're interested in signing up for our next intake that is happening on the 11th of April. The courses will run from the 11th of April through to May, end of May, start of June, and will run for 10 weeks. There's homework every week, there are graded assessments that you get full feedback on, and there's even an end of course exam that you get very detailed feedback on from myself. And at the end of it all, if you pass the course, you're awarded the colour corresponding badge in our Discord server to flaunt to your peers and show that you are a Carrot Poker School graduate like this little guy here. This has been Pete Clark. Please do sub to the channel, leave us some likes and comments down below. It's really going to help me grow the channel this year. Let me know what you're thinking about the content. We'll have loads more principles videos like this one that'll help you guys build your foundations. Until then, good luck at the tables, much love, and bye for now.